Yes.
Thank you, Murilo. Thank you, Joao. Thanks to all the organizers I haven't met or talked to. It's great to be virtually there. I don't know any Portuguese, but if I'm correct, Joao mentioned that hopefully in the future we'll have some opportunities to be there, or something with the future I've heard, or I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but it's my guessing that this is what was said at some point, or no. But anyway, so my paper, I guess you've seen the program. The title is Hatred for the Law, the Nómos of Destitution. And in this paper, I'm trying to do three things, in a sense. So the first one is to talk about, or in a way, let's say, to contribute to the anarchist or the anarchic critique of the law, of the state. So what we understand, in a sense, as the normative law. I mean, again, it's quite difficult to be able to define the law in one sense, as we know, and as first year undergraduate law students know, that the first question that they encounter when they study the philosophy of law is what is law, and of course they get all the different kind of ideas and perspectives. But anyway, when I refer to law, to the law of the state in this paper, I refer in a sense to anarchist kind of understanding of law, a normative, a dominant kind of understanding of the law, the one which in a sense justifies state's monopoly of violence. So the one thing that I am criticizing here through an anarchist kind of tradition and in a sense background is this understanding of the law of the state and of the state's monopoly of violence, with of course the help of the police. The second thing that I'm trying to do is to try to find a different kind of way of responding to this issue of the law, which is not, as far as I know, at least in the Anglo-American tradition, very common in anarchist circles, or at least I'm not familiar with any anarchists, again, in the Anglo-American and the Greek circles, talking about the creative potential of hatred. So I'm trying to think about hatred in a philosophical manner. So we've seen a lot of texts talking about love, the power of love and the philosophy of love, how love, especially in the radical left circles, what is coming to mind now is Alain Badiou, Michael Hart, for example, with Negri, they talked a lot about affection and love. And a good friend of mine has worked on this concept of love and with Badiou and Negri and Hart. But what about hatred? So going back to Aristotle, and I'll talk about it in the second section of my paper, and I'm trying to think about the creative and the combatant potential and the radical potential of thinking about hatred, or rethinking this potential of hatred in a philosophical kind of manner, let's say. And the last thing, which is linked to this, I mean, or the reason why I think that hatred is important in combating the dominance of the state, its law, and the police, is this idea of the destituent potential or destitution, and what I call the nómos of destitution as a different kind of an ethos, of a way of being, of of ways of being, of ways of thinking, of ways of doing politics, and so forth. So these are the three kind of premises, interconnected, let's say, premises of my paper. And I start. So the multiple anarchist groups, theoretical traditions, and schools of thought are perhaps united by a shared principle. That is, their critique of the state's monopoly of violence and the law's ability to justify and legalize this violence, while condemning at the same time any non-state violence. That is the sort of violence which does not serve the purposes of the state, or is that kind of any kind of violence that doesn't come from the state. And again, the concept of the state is another complex issue, but when I refer here to the state, I refer to any sort of relationship which is infused by hierarchical structures, in a sense, not only recognized states like, for example, Brazil or Cyprus or whatever, but any transnational organizations and so forth as well, even relationships between individuals. And the state achieves to do that, to condemn non-state violence, by excluding it from the sphere of legality. And this is the point where law comes into play. So the law, with the help of the police, and again, the police should be understood both as an institution, so the actual police, but also as a mentality or a mode of being that dominates the psyche of the modern subject, dominates, as I argue, our ways of life, and dictates the way we think, and of course the ways we act and live. So in what follows, I would like to argue that it is paramount to embrace and cultivate a hatred for the machinations of the law and the state. Hatred here, and as I mentioned earlier, I will explain further, should be understood as a creative force that carries the potential of a radical recreation of our ways of thinking and doing politics in an anarchic way. What I understand here, in a sense, as the nómos of destitution. This is because this examination and approach towards hatred in this creative way brings us to another important concept, and that is, as I said, that the destitution, the concept of the destitution, or the destituent potential. And to explain very briefly, by destitution, here I referred not to an effort to replace our current masters with new ones. This is, I think, the fundamental difference between constituent and destituent power, but rather it is an exercise of abandonment, an effort to destroy, desecrate, and spit on the grave of all these sacred commands of the law of the state that feast upon every moment of our lives. Okay, and now the first concept, the first section where I talk about the law and explain more why the law of the state is a problem, as I understand. As the German philosopher of the 19th century, Max Stirner, rightly puts it, and I'm quoting, "The state practices violence, suggesting that the individual should not do this." So in that sense, state behavior is an act of violence, and it calls its violence legal rights, but that of the individual, the state calls it a crime. And I'm ending the quote. So we can see how it starts, in a sense, or how even back in the 19th century it was understood that in fact there is a double standard between the violence practiced by the state and the violence practiced by anyone who does not belong into the sphere of the state. Bakunin, in a sense, even suggests that the main characteristic that defines someone as an anarchist is the demand for the absolute abolition of juridical law. and I'm quoting, "In a word, we reject all legislation, privileged, licensed, official, and legal, and all authority and influence, even though they may emanate from universal suffrage, for we are convinced that it can only turn to the advantage of a dominant minority of exploiters against the interest of the vast majority in subjection to them." And this is very striking. It is, as he says, it is in that sense that we are really anarchists. So Bakunin goes to the extent to define someone as an anarchist due to the opposition of that individual against the law and the state. So we can see that there is indeed quite a problematic relationship, to say the least, between any sort of anarchist, and there are multiple groups and schools of thought, and what is defined as the law of the state. And again, the reason for that is because law, according to the vast majority, if not all, anarchist thinkers and anarchists in more general, they argue that law, and we can see that from the Bakunin quotation, becomes a powerful weapon in the hands of the state and authorities, enabling them to distinguish between the good citizens, the law-abiding citizens, who respect the state's monopoly of violence, and of course the deviant subjects who question that monopoly. And of course, the other issue, so first issue is law's ability to justify monopoly of violence, the monopoly of violence of the state, and of course to distinguish between the good subjects and the bad, the good citizens and the bad subjects, in a sense, or the good citizens and the non-real or non-citizens at all. The second problem, according to anarchists, with the law is what Kropotkin identifies, and that is the ability of the law to pacify our spontaneity and our spirit of revolt against state power. So, and this is something that happens from a very young age. So according to Kropotkin, his very famous and very important, I think, essay, Law and Authority, he says that from a very young age, we are perverted by an education which seeks to kill in us the spirit of revolt and to develop that of submission to authority. We try to resolve any problems that we are faced with by referring to the law. So we are accustomed to thinking in terms of the law from a very young age. So we lose all initiative, we lose all habit of thinking and trying to find new ways, creative ways of how we should live, how we can relate to each other, how we can cooperate. For Kropotkin, that was a huge problem which hindered his effort to theorize about mutual aid and so forth, because we think that there is that everything should be resolved within the sphere of the law. We become entrapped into that kind of sphere, and we think in a one-dimensional way, in a sense. We lose spontaneity and creativity, in a sense. And of course, this kind of habit becomes even more problematic because it relates back to the first issue, the justification of monopoly of violence. Because we learn from school, from the family, from religion, and so forth, that we should obey the law. It is for our own benefit, and everyone who disobeys the law is the deviant one. We somehow internalize this justification of the monopoly of violence. So we think when we see that in the news that someone, for example, committed a crime, we immediately seek for the punishment of that person, just because we demand from the state to punish harshly that person, because we internalized this monopoly of violence, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of guilt, because every time we feel that guilt that we need to meet the standards of being this good citizen, that it will say the right thing and it will follow the commands of the law. Thus, this blind obedience to rules, or in that case to the law, becomes a habit that turns us into obedient subjects who are unable to respond to the challenges that we face in our everyday lives if the law does not offer us any solution, because, of course, as I mentioned, we expect every answer from the law. In a sense, we feel that we cannot do without the law. There is no alternative. Without the state, without the law, we are done. We will end up in a so-called Hobbesian situation where everyone is against everyone, and there's going to be chaos and death and brutish. The life will be brutish and so forth. Thus, we accept any restraint to our freedom in the name of security and all these things. Now, there is another important aspect, though, I think, again, to this dominance of this way of thinking. And this aspect is the operation of the police. So the authority of the law of the state is, of course, aided and cemented by the operation of the police. And here the police have a powerful double role in preserving but also expanding and creating anew this repressive status quo, or enforcing again and again, or ensuring that the law holds its powerful and dominant position. And I think it is very important to go back to Walter Benjamin's critique of violence in order to understand this double operation of the police. In his critique of violence, for example, Benjamin talks about two kinds of violence, amongst others, namely violence which is law-making and violence which is law-preserving. While the law-preserving category contains violence used in order to enforce existing laws, so for example, the police stop someone who's committing a theft and they arrest that person because they want to preserve the laws against theft. There is also this other category of violence, the law-making category, in the absence or indeterminacy of existing laws. And this law-making category comes to introduce new laws and rules in order to fill this vacuum. So when a law is not very clear, or whether something is not covered by a law, again, going back to Kropotkin, because we became so accustomed and thinking that we need a law for pretty much everything, this form of violence takes place in order to fill that vacuum. And Benjamin states something quite important, that these two kinds of violence come together in a sense, or we have a kind of a spectral mixture, as he says, in the example of the police, on the institution of the police. So the police is an institution, according to Benjamin, which mixtures these two kinds of violence, law-preserving and law-making violence. And this happens because the police use violence to enforce the laws of the state, as I said, when they arrest someone according to certain laws. But of course, there are situations where the police uses these or making use of these law-making violence in a sense. So, for example, there is a protest. There are particular laws regarding protest, but of course we know that they act on their own kind of discretion, let's say, if we can call it discretion, and they use their methods in a sense. And to that extent, Benjamin says that this is an action or an example of a law-making violence. A new law is created. So, for example, let's say that tear gas was used at a particular protest for the first time, and there wasn't a particular law suggesting that tear gas is legal. The use of tear gas is legal, but under the discretion of the particular police unit, tear gas was used, and after that, perhaps that particular state adopted the use of tear gas under their laws. So, by preserving the law of the state, the police created a new law in a sense. Okay. And of course, the police is one of the main enforcers of this monopoly of violence of the state again. So, to this extent, the ever-pervasive, formless presence-absence of the police. So, because we became so accustomed to the law, and the police is the body which brings together law-preserving and law-making power, and law-making violence, this action of the police is also internalized, and we arrive at a position where the modern subject, in a sense, feels that there is always some indeterminacy or a vacuum. So the modern subject is not at any time at ease, feeling that at every time they can be in trouble. So they need to overzealously obey the laws and be obedient and so forth, or they also feel that they need to oppose any subject which is considered to be deviant for any particular reason, either because they have the wrong color, or the wrong political beliefs, the wrong religion, and so forth. And this complete submission, in a sense, inaugurates what Saul Newman calls a security ideology, in a sense. So the law of the state, with the help from the police, but also the police as a mentality, creates this obedient subject which submits itself, but also wants to submit in a quasi or fully fascistic way everything that does not obey to these kind of commands of the law. Now, what is the solution to this, in a sense? And this is where hatred comes into play. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm not sure if it is the answer, but I find something quite compelling in hatred. And I think this has to do with the failures of the nice kind of words that we I don't want to speak about everyone, but people at least who engage in radical politics in one way or another. I think that we are sometimes too polite, and we focus more on the good things, in a sense, rather than something more, combatant. So this is why I thought that hatred might work differently, let's say. So what I'm trying to do here, I went back to Aristotle. And Aristotle says something quite interesting about hatred. So Aristotle offers an interesting evaluation and understanding of hatred in the ancient Greek tradition, which significantly differs from the common understanding of hatred as a negative affect. So in his Politics, for example, the philosopher distinguishes between anger and hatred. While for him anger is included in hatred and it can sometimes be the cause of a more imminent action, quoting, "The angry are more impetuous in making an attack, for they do not follow rational principle, and men are very apt to give way to their passions when they are insulted," end of quote. So the angry person is more irrational in a sense. And anger, it is often a cause for an irrational action, according to Aristotle. On the contrary, hatred, and again this is another quote, is more reasonable, for anger is accompanied by pain, which is an impediment to reason, whereas hatred is painless. But why is that? In the way that I understand it, hatred as an affect is not something which is directed on oneself. So if I'm angry, I feel that pain, I feel that grudge against something or against myself, in a sense. But with hatred is quite different, I think. With hatred, we don't immediately direct our hatred against something. So, okay, I hate the state, but it is very, abstract to say that I hate the state. But if I say that I'm angry against that particular action, there is a focus. There's a focus against something. So I feel the pain at that moment. But with hatred, I think it's different, because I don't feel the pain. I simply make a rational deduction and I say that, okay, the state did this, did that. The law of the state is oppressive because of multiple reasons. So I arrive at a point where I decide that, I hate this kind of life. And immediately I'm starting to think about an alternative when I arrive at this position. So, for example, in Aeschylus' tragedy, Prometheus Bound, the Titan Prometheus says to god Hermes, "I have learned to hate traitors." It doesn't say, "I hate Zeus because he's a traitor." He's angry at Zeus because he has these traits of traitors, but he hates traitors as a kind, let's say. So he doesn't feel the pain at that moment. He feels the pain because he's angry, and he says that multiple times in the tragedy, "I'm angry at Zeus because I helped him, and now he bowed me, and he has the eagle eating my liver," and so forth. But the reason in the end that I am angry at Zeus is because I hate traitors. I came to the rational deduction that this kind of people is not for me. So I need to do something about it, in a sense. So to that extent, hatred is something that you learn, quite important. And it is not based on mere provocation, unlike anger. It is not a particular treason that triggers your consent towards a particular action, but rather the qualities of traders altogether. Of course, perhaps it was an initial treason that triggered the subsequent enmity against the type of traders. But if you arrive at the point where you say, listen, I hate traders, it doesn't mean that you, first of all, you don't know all the traders in history, so you cannot have a personal grudge against them, but rather you don't, you cannot live with the qualities of these people around you in a sense. Similarly with the state and its laws. Now, in a very different kind of philosophical tradition and period, and that period is the 18th century, essayist and philosopher William Hazlitt, British philosopher, revisits the issue of hatred in his essay, The Pleasure of Hating. It's quite interesting as an essay. If you'd like to read it. It's short. He discusses a boxing match, so and he arrives at the point where he talks about this philosophical kind of thing about hatred. So in this passage, Hazlitt asserts that in his view on the way people need to have something to hate, to feel disgustful, to feel bigotry towards, and to overall have something other than the blunt pull of neutrality to keep themselves entertained. So another important element with hatred is that it takes away this element of neutrality and pacification, which is a deep issue with contemporary politics, and of course something that started with liberalism, with this idea of neutrality, and of course something that was deeply internalized and cemented the way of thinking of the modern Western, at least, citizen. I'm neutral. I don't get into trouble. I want to live my life and don't get me into trouble at all. So I don't want any issues with the law or with the state. So with hatred, we are done with neutrality. So Hazlitt, as he suggests, hatred becomes a creative force, a basis of life that keeps our lives going. As he very interestingly closes the aforementioned essay, and I'm quoting, "Mistaken as I have been in my public and private hopes, calculating others from myself and calculating wrong, always disappointed where I placed most reliance, the dupe of friendship and the fool of love. Have I not reason to hate and to despise myself? Indeed I do, and chiefly for not having hated and despised the word enough." This is the end of the quote. So the only reason for hating himself is for not hating enough, in a sense. So hatred then is to be understood as an affect with a creative or even positive potential, ironically or paradoxically. And the reason for this is because we arrive at a point where we can base our life on this hatred against something, and we are also in a position to rationally arrive at the point where we say that, okay, this is enough. Things are not getting better, or we cannot stand how things are. So, something radical and something needs to be happening. Hatred, then, it is not a mere reaction towards something that causes our consent or anger, but rather an active affect. So action is very important for hatred, which causes our conscious and firm rupture with the hateful object, in that case, the state and its laws. And for that reason, it is important for the critique of the law that I present here, because this hatred and this need for the rupture or abandonment lead me to this notion of destitution, which is the final element of my argument here. So what I refer to as nómos in the paper, and I want to be clear, does not have anything to do with the archist and normative notion of the law of the state, of course. Instead, nómos should be understood as an ethical and active way of doing politics in an anarchic manner. That is, without anarchy or without following the commands of the normative law. So, Agamben, for example, it's the first example that comes to mind, talks about the etymological understanding of arche, not only as a beginning or a foundational ground, but also as a command. The archon, for example, in Homeric passages, was the leader, was the person responsible for giving the commands. It wasn't only, the arche is not just the foundation, but also a command. An anarchic mode of existing, that is ethos, and doing politics does not seek to replace or displace the current archist mentality of the subject of the law or the police or any other dogmatic norms and rules, but to be done with them. So destroy them, in a sense. It is in that sense that we should talk here about an abandonment, a disengagement, a desecration, or a destituent potentiality. However, and again, it is something that we need to make clear, I think it's important, when we talk about disengagement, abandonment, or destitution, we should make clear that this is not an acceptance of defeat. So we don't say, okay, we cannot do anything, I'm abandoning everything and that's it. And it is not a pessimistic call for abandonment of any struggle. My understanding of this destitution is rather an openness to a new creation, in a sense. Abandoning something means that perhaps I exhausted every potentiality for reconciliation, so I abandoned it, and I'm trying to create something new. Gilles Deleuze has an interesting paper on that, where he distinguishes between being tired and being exhausted, when he talks about Beckett's The Exhausted. And he says that when I'm exhausted, I have exhausted every possibility of working on something, so I'm creating something new. Whereas when I'm tired, it's more pessimistic because I abandon pretty much everything and creation altogether. And I'm going to the Invisible Committee in order to define this notion of the destitution or the destituent potential. And they say, and I'm quoting, destitution or the destituent comes from destituere in Latin, which means to place standing separate, raise up in isolation, to abandon, put aside, let drop, knock down, to let down, or deceive. Again, this notion of deceiving the law is important as well, to play differently, to not accept to play their game, but rather to deceive them. And they also distinguish between the constituent logic, which means that we crash against the power apparatus in order to take control of it or replace the current power with a new one, the old masters with new one. The destituent potential is concerned instead with escaping from it altogether, from this logic of masters, of arche, by removing any hold on the need of law. Again, we're going back to Kropotkin's completely different way of thinking that, listen, we don't need the law to exist. We don't need the state to exist. We need perhaps to start deceiving them in order to create something, or start hating them, in order to go back to the issue of hate. And of course, they end their quoting by suggesting that destitution does not suggest that we should abandon the struggle, but rather this acting through destitution is something that fastens on the struggle's positivity. So it revitalizes the struggle, in a sense. So perhaps a first step, or in better terms, a second step after learning how to hate, is to shift towards a direction of that requires a loss of interest for the centrality of the notion of the law, of the state, and the modern subject as the good citizen. And something that requires, I suppose, a process of becoming curious, or a process of re-encountering each other and trying to find each other, or lose each other, lose ourselves, or lose our certainties, and so forth. Starting question the need of something. So this is what I refer to as openness to new kind of experiencing the world, experiencing each other and counting each other, of how we distributing our bodies and senses in space and time, in a sense. And to that extent, hatred plays an important role because, as I mentioned, it has a creative potential, and it can act also as a basis of a new understanding of life, in a sense. Okay, so, and of course, it's a new way of encountering our sensations, our affects, by abandoning the pre-given categories and definitions or classifications by the law, by the state, and it is an effort to become more attuned to the heres and nows. So with this encountering and this acceptance of the positivity of hatred, we can start rethinking anew about our values, or whether we should need to refer to values, if this notion of values is something very moralizing and very dogmatic. Perhaps we need to start thinking about something else. So we need to become more attentive to the new possibilities that we are faced with, and perhaps we need to become more curious and more courageous in, saying that, things doesn't work anymore, or things are unbearable. So this is not the ways that we want to live. We want to do something about it, perhaps. So abandoning and becoming curious is a strive, as I said, a struggle of rearranging or turning oneself into something new. And this is, of course, a risky enterprise, because we get away of this comfort zone that we became so accustomed to. Again, Kropotkin is very relevant here. But I think it's worth trying, because the situation all around the world is quite difficult, and I think only a radical kind of break with what we have is a potential way out. So, as I argue, such transformation of abandonment ought to be a radical one, because a mere improvement that happens gradually and not totally runs the risk of falling again within the dogmatism of Arche, of a new police mentality, or a supposedly benevolent master in the name of progress, in the name of security, and so forth. And Bakunin has a very nice quote for all these people arguing that this radical potential is a risky one and that it is a utopian one and so forth. He says, after all, a false and feeble light kindled only to mislead those who follow it. So we need perhaps to follow this feeble light and to be misled by it in order to find our new ways. To conclude, in a sense, we need also to, and this is an inconclusive conclusion in a sense. These anarchic ethos and politics are ones that should, if they are to offer an alternative, be defined by a certain humility in a sense, recognizing the potential failure as ever present and accepting that such a potentiality does not signify the end of our transformations and becomings, but instead they are very modality of experimentation. So again, we need to stress that it is worth trying to learn how to hate and learn how to destitute and how to abandon the familiar, even though that we may fail. And it is important to take into consideration that failure is always and very likely outcome in a sense. I think this is something that gives us a courage to go on. Recognizing this possibility of failure is a decisive step in order to take a way out of the habitual, and it is all to be characterized by a readiness to face and accept our shortcomings and possibilities or impossibilities in terms of expressing or existing and thinking otherwise. So of existing within a different kind of ethos, these nómos of destitution, as I call it here. And to conclude with, by paraphrasing Alfredo Bonanno, in the world where arrogance prevails, I think it is high time to kill the cop inside us before a new police or a new law prevents us to do so. Thank you.